To the average American living in the 20th century, A&P was a name you were most likely very well acquainted with. Once the largest grocery store and overall largest retailer in the United States, A&P operated over 15,000 stores at its peak, as the name proclaims, from the Atlantic to the Pacific coast. A&P was one of America's oldest and most iconic brands, and today, one of its most famous retail casualties. Today, we'll explore the company's century-and-a-half-long history and what exactly happened to the food service monolith. George Gilman came from a wealthy family with a long lineage going all the way back to the Mayflower. He ran an established tanning business started by his father, and in the mid-1850s, Gilman founded a successor called Gilman & Company to continue the business. He built a new warehouse at 98 Gold Street in Manhattan with a separate office in St. Louis, Missouri. In 1859, Gilman decided to go in a different direction, entering the tea and coffee industry. The new Gilman Company was a wholesaler of tea and coffee, using his connections to purchase the goods right off the ships in the harbor, allowing them to avoid brokers and sell at a lower price than the competition. They did so through mail ordering. By the early 1860s, Gilman & Company was renamed the Great American Tea Company, and he was joined by his new partner, George Huntington Hartford. Hartford entered retail at 18 years old, working in a dry goods store in Boston. He'd come to work with Gilman in his tanning business and became involved in the reworking of the company. Great American Tea had become such a popular operation that they began opening their own retail stores. The first was opened on New York's Vesey Street in 1861. With their new capital, they went all out. This was an era when retailers really tried to wow their customers, and Great American Tea was no different. The storefront was red and gold with a series of gas lights, which resembled the letter T. On Saturdays, customers were entertained by a brass band. By the end of the decade, there were 11 of these impressive stores, and the company renamed itself the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, A&P, commemorating the Transcontinental Railroad. Like the trains on its tracks, A&P began their expansion across the country. They were also humanitarians. During the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, A&P sent workers and food to aid in the disaster. They set up shop, and Chicago became one of their biggest markets. This was a time of great expansion. They soon reached 100 stores, making A&P the most prominent chain in the grocery industry. They had traveling A&P salesmen pushing the brand into more rural areas. George Gilman would retire in 1878. Leaving Hartford to run the company. The Hartford family era would last for the next 80 years. A&P was one of the first to introduce their own private labels to provide less expensive alternatives for their customers. They debuted 8 o'clock breakfast coffee in 1882, which continued to be a highly coveted brand for the rest of the company's existence. Hartford's sons, George Jr. and John, eventually joined the business as well, and would play a big role in the future of A&P. By 1900, they were approaching 200 locations and hit $5.6 million in sales. One of the major issues of the 1910s was the rising cost of living. Food prices had shot up 35% in the last decade, and this was hurting Americans. John Hartford introduced the cash and carry economy store. These quickly proved their worth. They cost peanuts to run and only needed a single employee. They had a meticulous operating manual and ordered the stores to have the same merchandise in the same locations at every store, so it would be easy to find products. These economy stores became the backbone of A&P and were easy to expand, exploding to 1,600 locations by 1915. One of the early clerks was Ralph Berger, who started at $11 a week. He was a hard worker and would rise through the ranks over the coming decades. George Hartford Sr. passed away in 1917. George Jr. became chairman and John president. By 1925, the leadership of the Hartford brothers had led A&P into its greatest era. They operated a staggering 14,000 economy stores with $440 million in sales. 2 years later, they opened their first stores in Canada. Meanwhile, they diversified, adding meat counters. They started selling prepackaged meat, an industry first. They opened bakeries, candy shops, their own laboratories for food testing. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression destroyed much of the retail industry. Most companies had to reorganize, sell out, or completely shutter their operations. When the dust settled, A&P was one of the few companies mostly unaffected by the crash. The meticulous care that went into their company's organization made them seemingly indestructible. That year, which was terrible for so many others, A&P hit $1 billion in sales and opened its 15,709th store. In those days, these numbers were rarely heard, if ever. Even F.W. Woolworth, the five-and-dime retailer considered one of the biggest chains at the time, sat far, far below that number, at around 2,200. Although this would prove to be the peak for A&P, they held steady as the largest U.S. grocer and largest retailer, period. With the 1930s came an innovation in food service retail, the supermarket. At first, they weren't interested in the concept, but when they finally opened an A&P supermarket, the results spoke for themselves. The development of self-service, popularized in the grocery industry by Piggly Wiggly earlier in the century, made these kinds of stores cheaper to run than their predecessors. By the end of the decade, A&P had over 1,000 supermarkets. The growth seemed unstoppable. However, the 1936 Robinson-Patman Act, which went about curbing anti-competitive pricing strategies used by chain stores, hurt A&P more than any other chain. This, combined with other antitrust legislation, would crumble their foundation. These laws resulted in the initial rise of modern discounters. They found a way around the price laws by a slew of programs. A&P tried to counter price laws by producing more of their own brands, which were expensive but could be sold cheap. This ended up with mixed results. Many people wanted name brands more than A&P's house brands. After World War II, A&P's future was unsure. Many of their competitors expanded outside of the cities, into the growing suburbs. This afforded extra space, and supermarkets were really getting super. They were bigger and more modern than ever. Many were suspicious or outright against suburban sprawl, and A&P thought the same. They'd come to regret that stance, and it would turn out to be the beginning of their downfall. As for their existing stores, they simply weren't keeping them up to date. By 1950, they had quickly fallen to just 4,500 locations. Now back to Ralph Berger, our young clerk from earlier in the century. He'd climbed his way up the executive suite to become president of the company. John Hartford passed away in '51 and George Jr. in '57. Thus bringing the Hartford family's involvement in A&P to an end. Berger's aim was to keep their spirit and continue their legacies after their deaths. He did just that, and I think he didn't want to chance it all on risky investments that, for all he knew, may have been fads, like the suburbs. There was the Hartford Foundation, which the brothers set up for mostly medical philanthropy, and that took a lot of funding, as did trusts benefiting the Hartford family. I see this as the last chance for A&P to modernize. Times had been tough, but they still had a remaining 4,000 locations, which was nothing to sneeze at. Problem was, all of them were stuck in the 30s and 40s. The company was taken public, and Berger would lead it quite successfully for the next 12 years, after which he, too, passed away in 1969. By that time, A&P had over $5 billion in annual sales. The second largest grocery store chain was Safeway, and they made less than half as much. Although, even after Berger, succeeding management couldn't seem to shake A&P's problems. William Walsh, former A&P executive vice president, outlined this era in his 1986 book, The Rise and Decline of the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. I think it boils down the main reasons for A&P's later problems. 1. A&P didn't have enough money to keep up, mostly due to the company being tied up in the Hartford Foundation and family trusts. They also spent a lot of money on manufacturing their own products. 2. The stores lacked the brands customers wanted. They were frequently out of stock, and they supplemented this with their own private brands. However, customers who wanted national brands were often out of luck. 3. A&P's staff were too expensive. Like we saw with the Sears pensioners in recent times, many of their employees were lifers, and paying them was becoming a hassle. Other chains didn't have as much of a problem with this due to higher turnover from new store openings. William J. Kane was appointed president and attempted to tackle some of these troubles. A&P was losing money, and he decided the best way to fix it was to move to wholesale discount. They converted A&P stores into warehouse outlets. These ultimately became Warehouse Economy Outlet. This new venture absorbed 70% of A&P stores. The price-cutting measures were uncharacteristically cutthroat for A&P and was certainly not appreciated by competitors. The truth is, they never finished ironing out what WEO even meant, a new chain or just a slogan. Before the job was done, Kane resigned and was replaced by Grant Gentry from Jewel. Gentry axed 1/3 of their stores, 12,000 of the oldest, least profitable, and smallest units, too small to be warehouse stores. Their steep discounts meant they were making pennies on the dollar, and the 70s recession made it all the worse. The WEO plans were revised and revised again until near nothing was left. A 1974 study revealed their prices had become near identical to those of Safeway, so all the carnage and identity crises were ultimately worthless. A&P had closed so many stores that Safeway became the new largest grocery chain. Meanwhile, while Gentry had modernized the chain, profits had crashed as a side effect. They felt it would be best to address the last few years publicly. They stated, A&P has always stood for two things, price and pride. Then, somehow, we let price and pride get out of balance. Price without pride is no bargain, and we suffered for it. Yes, you read that right. The former #1 grocery chain in the world issued an apology to the public for somehow. That somehow was WEO. It was vague, with no concrete way forward. Prices were already back to normal, but as for pride, that was yet to be. What did it mean? Well, they wanted to focus on name brands and promotions, as well as better customer service, and time would tell if those would be fully realized. They continued building new stores and remodeling existing locations while juggling a leaking budget. Jonathan L. Scott replaced Gentry. He came from Albertsons. Scott focused on cutting losses. His plan was to stop the remodeling and began store closures and employee terminations. The terminations only made the service worse, but the closures allowed for more investment into modern supermarkets. They also launched Family Mart, which had a larger footprint. But again, the inflation of the 70s ended up hurting this growth. In 1979, the German Tengelmann Group bought controlling stake in A&P. They appointed former CEO of Grand Union Supermarkets, James Wood, as chairman and CEO of A&P. Wood continued a lot of Scott's initiatives and simplified the operation to focus on their primary businesses. He closed nearly 40% of A&P's stores, shut down most of their manufacturing, and by the mid-80s, A&P was turning a profit again. With cash in hand, Wood's management introduced updated store formats and worked hard to bring back customers. He concentrated the chain on its prime markets, like the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, and focused on buying instead of building. A&P bought out several competitors, including Kohl's Food Stores, Pantry's Pride, Dominion Stores in Canada, and former Stop and Shop locations. By the end of the decade, A&P's profits were above the industry average, with sales of $11 billion. This was an impressive turnaround, but the outdated stores remained an issue. They'd begun renovations, but the early 90s recession tanked a lot of their main markets and pushed A&P back into the red. Christian Haub, son of Erevan Haub, the principal owner of the Tengelmann Group, became president of A&P in '94, and later CEO. He worked to open large format supermarkets and modernize many of their existing units. They also invested in modern computer systems. In the South, A&P was suffering, and they ended up mostly pulling out of the region. These closures left them with 4 main markets of the Northeast, Midwest, New Orleans, and Ontario, Canada. By the new millennium, which was A&P's 3rd century of operation, Walmart's position in the grocery industry had become gargantuan. But the Northeast was still A&P country, so they focused everything there. Much of the industry was downsizing, as did A&P. It became a selling game, trying to keep their heads up and their prime markets in the black. 2003 was the company's largest loss in history. They closed Kohl's Food Stores, pulling out of Vermont and New Hampshire. This brought them to a little over 500 stores. That same year, 8 O'Clock Breakfast Coffee, perhaps the company's most iconic house brand, and its last manufacturing enterprise, was sold off. In 2005, they sold their Canadian division. 2 years later, they left New Orleans. A&P was now back to its roots as an exclusively Northeastern chain, somewhere that Walmart didn't run the grocery business. 2 years later, they bought out Pathmark, a major competitor in the region. This regained A&P their top position in New York City, but also saddled them with debt. 2009 was A&P's 150th anniversary. In that time, they'd gone from local to national to international, then back to local. They sat at about 400 locations. Hopes to keep their position were lost in the 2008 recession, and their customers left for cheaper alternatives. Who else but Walmart? The word bankruptcy was being thrown around by the end of the decade. In December 2010, A&P did file for bankruptcy, Chapter 11. This revealed their monetary position: $2.5 billion in assets and $1 billion more than that in debt. A&P was then put up for sale. Despite attempts at turnarounds with firms like Goldman Sachs and a revolving line of executives, no buyer seemed interested. By 2015, A&P entered its 2nd bankruptcy filing. It seemed about as close to a liquidation as you could get, without calling it that. They sold off everything. By Thanksgiving, all their supermarkets were bought out, closed, or auctioned off. Just like that, the last remnants of a monolith had crumbled.